Most people think disappointment comes from bad luck, difficult people, or the harshness of life. But often, the real cause is much quieter. We suffer because we expect too much from others. We expect people to understand us without explanation, value us without inconsistency, and return the same energy we so freely give. But life rarely moves according to those inner expectations, and this is where much of human suffering begins. The mind creates silent demands, then feels wounded when reality does not obey them. Wisdom teaches that the more expectations you place on others, the more power you hand them over your emotional state. Remember, expectations feeds frustration and disappointment. It is an unhealthy attachment to people, things, and outcomes. But the moment you stop expecting people to carry the weight of your peace, something begins to change. Your mind becomes lighter, your emotions become steadier, and your happiness no longer depends so heavily on what others do, say, or fail to give. In this video, you will discover Buddha's timeless insights on how to release expectations, protect your peace, and live with greater emotional freedom. 1. Expectations quietly become emotional burdens. Expectations often appear harmless in the beginning. They seem natural, even reasonable. You expect people to be honest, relationships to feel balanced, and life to unfold in ways that make sense to you. On the surface, these expectations may seem like normal parts of caring, but over time, what begins as expectation slowly becomes emotional weight. The mind starts creating silent rules for how life should behave. It decides how people should respond, how much they should care, how quickly they should understand, and how consistently they should show up. Most of these expectations are never spoken aloud, yet they quietly shape how we experience every interaction. The moment reality fails to meet them, disappointment begins. This is how expectations become emotional burdens. They place invisible pressure on every relationship and every outcome. Instead of allowing people to be who they are, the mind begins measuring them against an internal script. Instead of meeting life as it unfolds, the mind compares every moment to what it hoped would happen. That constant comparison creates tension. A delayed reply becomes more than a delay. It becomes neglect. A misunderstanding becomes more than confusion. It becomes rejection. A change in someone's behavior becomes more than a shift in mood. It becomes proof that something is wrong. In this way, expectations turn ordinary moments into emotional strain. The burden grows heavier because expectations tie your peace to things you cannot control. Your mood becomes influenced by how others respond, how much they notice, and whether life unfolds according to your preferences. The more expectations you carry, the more fragile your inner world becomes. This is why even small disappointments can feel so heavy. They are not painful only because of what happened. They are painful because of what the mind expected to happen instead. The event is often small. The burden comes from the meaning attached to it. When expectations begin to loosen, so does that emotional weight. The mind stops demanding that people behave perfectly in order for peace to remain. It stops turning every unmet hope into suffering. And in that release, relationships begin to feel lighter, life feels less personal, and the heart becomes easier to protect. Expectations become burdens when they silently ask the world to carry the responsibility for your peace. Freedom begins when that burden is no longer placed on people, outcomes, or imagined results. The less the mind demands, the less it suffers, and the less it suffers, the more peaceful life becomes. 2. Your happiness should not depend on others. Yet, this is where many people quietly place it without realizing. They place their peace in someone else's attention, their worth in someone else's approval, their emotional balance in how gently they are treated, how often they are chosen, how consistently they are understood, and slowly, without meaning to, they hand over the responsibility for their inner world to people who were never meant to carry it. At first, it feels natural. We all want love. We all want warmth, understanding, connection. There is nothing wrong with that. Human connection is beautiful. But suffering begins when connection turns into dependence, when the heart begins to believe that peace can only exist if someone else behaves the right way. This is where happiness becomes fragile. The Buddha taught that real peace cannot be built on what is unstable, and other people, no matter how kind or loving, are still unstable by nature. They change, their moods shift, their attention moves. Their capacity rises and falls. Some days they understand you, some days they do not. Some days they show up with warmth, some days they are lost in their own pain. If your happiness is tied to their consistency, then your peace will rise and fall with every change in them. This is why so many people feel emotionally exhausted, not because they are unloved, but because they have unknowingly made other people responsible for how they feel. They wait to feel okay until someone replies. They wait to feel worthy until someone chooses them. They wait to feel calm until someone finally understands their heart. And in that waiting, they suffer. Real peace begins when you stop asking others to regulate what only you can steady within yourself. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean needing no one. It means learning to receive love without making it the source of your stability. It means appreciating connection without placing your emotional survival inside it. When happiness depends entirely on others, it becomes fragile. But when it begins within, relationships become lighter, love becomes freer, and the heart no longer collapses every time someone fails to give what it hoped for. This is where peace deepens, not when others finally behave perfectly, but when your happiness is no longer built on their ability to do so. 3. People can only offer what they carry within. This is one of the quiet truths that softens disappointment. A person filled with peace can offer calm. A person filled with kindness can offer warmth. But someone carrying confusion, pain, or emotional distance will often give that instead, even when they do not mean to. In Buddhist understanding, people respond from the state of their own mind. The Buddha taught that our actions are shaped by our inner condition. This is why expecting clarity from someone lost in confusion or deep care from someone disconnected from themselves often leads to unnecessary pain. It is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is simply limitation. People give from their level of awareness, from their wounds, from their healing, from what they have or have not yet learned to hold within themselves. When you understand this, resentment begins to soften. You stop taking every lack personally, and with that understanding, the heart becomes lighter, calmer, and far less disappointed. For example, you may expect emotional support from someone who has never learned how to understand emotions. You may expect loyalty from someone who values convenience more than commitment. You may expect deep understanding from someone who barely understands their own thoughts and feelings. 4. Those who lack inner clarity cannot offer it to others. Someone who is deeply confused within themselves will struggle to bring calm to your chaos. Someone who has not learned how to sit with their own emotions will not know how to hold yours with care. This is why the Buddha placed so much importance on inner awareness. A restless mind creates restless actions. A confused mind creates confusion around it. People do not give from what they wish they had. They give from what they have cultivated within. This is why some people respond with avoidance, defensiveness, or emotional distance, even when what you needed was understanding. It is not always because they do not care. Often, they simply do not know how to offer what they have never learned to create inside themselves. When you understand this, your pain becomes softer. You stop demanding wisdom from the ungrounded. You stop expecting emotional safety from the emotionally lost. And in that understanding, disappointment begins to loosen its grip. 5. Let go of expectation, and freedom follows, though not all at once. It begins so quietly that many people miss it in the beginning. There is no dramatic moment, no sudden shift in the sky, no instant transformation in the heart. There is only a subtle loosening, a soft release, a quiet moment where the mind becomes tired of carrying what it was never meant to hold. For so long, the mind has been building small conditions around peace. I can relax when they understand me. I can feel calm when they respond the way I hoped. I can feel secure when life unfolds according to the image I created in my head. And without noticing it, peace becomes delayed, postponed, handed over to people, outcomes, and moments that were never stable enough to hold it. This is how suffering often begins, not through life itself, but through the quiet contract the mind creates with life. I will be okay, but only if this happens. I will feel at peace, but only if they act the way I need them to. I will feel safe, but only if nothing changes in ways I did not expect. These conditions become invisible cages. They do not always look painful at first. They look reasonable. They look human, but slowly they tighten around the heart. The Buddha taught that suffering grows from attachment, and expectation is one of attachment's most subtle forms. It is attachment dressed in softer clothing. It does not always arrive as desire. Sometimes it arrives as hope, as emotional investment, as the quiet wish for people to love us in the exact way we have imagined love should feel. But beneath that hope, there is still clinging. The mind reaches outward and says, I need this to happen in order to remain at peace. And this is where the weight begins. Because life does not move according to the private demands of the mind, people do not always respond how you hoped. They misunderstand, they forget, they become distracted. They fail to notice what you thought was obvious. They carry burdens you cannot see. They move through their own confusion, their own fears, their own limitations. And yet the mind, still holding its expectation, turns every difference into disappointment. A delayed reply becomes distance. A quiet evening becomes rejection. A distracted tone becomes proof that something is wrong. This is how expectation quietly distorts reality. It does not let life be what it is. It keeps comparing what is happening to what should have happened, and in that comparison, peace begins to disappear. This is why letting go feels so unfamiliar at first. The mind has spent years believing that control is safety, that expectation is protection, that if it prepares enough, predicts enough, hopes carefully enough, it can avoid disappointment. But expectation has never truly protected the heart. It has only made the heart more fragile by tying its peace to things it cannot control. To let go of expectation is not to become indifferent. It is not withdrawal. It is not emotional distance. It is something gentler than that. It is the quiet decision to stop forcing life to match the shape of your preferences. It is the willingness to let people be human without turning their limitations into your suffering. It is the understanding that love can remain even when control is released. This is where Buddhist wisdom becomes deeply practical. The Buddha did not teach detachment as coldness. He taught it as freedom. Detachment is not the absence of love. It is the absence of clinging. It is the ability to care deeply without handing your inner stability to what is unstable. To love someone and still remain rooted in yourself. To hope without demanding. To care without collapsing. And when this begins, even gently, the heart changes. You stop reading every silence as rejection. You stop turning every delay into a wound. You stop expecting people to carry emotional responsibilities they may not even understand they were given. The mind becomes less reactive because it is no longer constantly measuring reality against an internal script. There is more room now, more breath, more space between what happens and what you feel about it. And in that space, peace begins to return. Not because life has become easier, not because people suddenly become wiser, kinder, more aware, or more consistent, but because your peace is no longer chained to their ability to be any of those things. You begin to understand that freedom was never about controlling how life unfolds. It was about no longer needing it to unfold in one specific way in order to remain steady within yourself. This is the beginning of inner freedom, quiet, unremarkable from the outside, but profound within. The moment expectation loosens, suffering loses one of its deepest roots. And what remains is not emptiness. What remains is space, space to breathe, space to see clearly, space to meet life without demanding that it become something else before you allow yourself to be at peace. That is how freedom follows. Not all at once, but gently, the moment you stop asking life to earn your peace. And once that begins, something even quieter starts to unfold. In the absence of constant expectation, the heart begins to rest. Not because everything is suddenly easy, but because the mind is no longer exhausting itself, trying to force life into a shape it was never meant to keep. This is the freedom most people spend their lives searching for in other people. They search for it in reassurance, in approval, in being chosen, in being understood exactly the way they long to be understood. They believe peace will come when someone finally responds the right way, stays the right way, loves them the right way. But that kind of peace is always fragile because it depends on what cannot be controlled. Real freedom begins when that dependence softens. You begin to notice how much energy was once spent waiting for the message, waiting for the apology, waiting for someone to become more aware, more available, more emotionally capable than they have shown themselves to be. And in that waiting, life was quietly passing, peace was being postponed. The present moment was being traded for imagined emotional resolution. But when expectation loosens, you stop waiting for life to become emotionally perfect before allowing yourself to be at ease. This is where peace becomes real. You begin to meet people with more clarity. You stop asking them to be more than what they have shown they can be. You stop turning their limitations into personal wounds. You begin to see them more honestly. Some people can offer warmth, some can offer presence, some can offer very little beyond what they have survived. And instead of making war with reality, you simply begin to see it clearly. This clarity is not bitterness, it is peace. The Buddha taught that wisdom begins when we see things as they are, not as we wish them to be. And this is where so much suffering quietly ends. Not because life changes, but because illusion does. You stop asking unstable things to make you feel stable. You stop asking inconsistent people to give you permanent peace. You stop building your emotional life on foundations that were never steady to begin with. And because of that, something stronger begins to grow within you. You become less reactive, less desperate for reassurance, less shaken by what once pulled so heavily on the heart. The same silence that once made you anxious now feels neutral. The same distance that once felt painful now simply feels honest. The same uncertainty that once disturbed your peace no longer has the same power over you. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped clinging. And this is the difference that changes everything. You still love, you still feel, you still hope. But now there is space around those feelings, space to breathe, space to observe, space to remain steady, even when life does not move in the direction you hoped. This is what freedom actually feels like. It is not detachment from life, it is detachment from the need to control it. It is the quiet strength of allowing life to be what it is, while remaining rooted in yourself. And from that place, happiness becomes simpler, softer, less dramatic. no longer built on perfect outcomes or perfect people. It begins to rise from something far more stable. A mind that no longer argues with reality. A heart that no longer needs life to prove itself before it allows peace in. This is where freedom settles, not in having everything you wanted, but in no longer needing everything to happen your way in order to feel whole. And when that truth is finally lived, not just understood, the heart becomes lighter, the mind becomes quieter, and peace no longer feels distant. It feels natural. 6. Self-reliance strengthens the mind from within, and this is the kind of strength most people spend years searching for in places that were never meant to hold it. They search for it in reassurance, in attention, in being understood without needing to explain, in being chosen often enough to feel secure, and for a while, this can feel comforting. It can feel safe to place your emotional balance in the hands of people who know how to calm you, soothe you, or make you feel wanted. But comfort is not the same as strength. Comfort can disappear the moment life changes. Strength remains, even when it does. This is why so many people feel emotionally tired, not because they are weak, but because they have built their peace on things that cannot stay steady. They feel calm when someone responds warmly. They feel secure when someone stays close. They feel worthy when they are noticed, chosen, included. But when those things shift, and they always do, the mind begins to shake. Doubt enters. Anxiety rises. And what once felt like peace reveals itself to have been dependence. The Buddha taught that anything unstable cannot become the foundation of lasting peace. And other people, no matter how loving they are still unstable by nature. Their moods change, their attention moves, their wounds surface, their ability to give rises and falls. Some days they can meet you with patience. Some days they are too lost in their own burdens to hold even themselves. If your inner stability depends on their consistency, then your peace will always remain fragile. This is where self-reliance becomes sacred, not as isolation, not as emotional distance, but as the quiet ability to remain inwardly steady, even when life around you becomes uncertain. Self-reliance is not the refusal to receive love, it is the refusal to make love the only place your peace can live. There is a deep calm that begins to grow when you stop asking others to constantly regulate what you have not yet learned to steady within yourself. When sadness comes, you learn how to sit with it. When disappointment rises, you learn how to soften without collapsing. When loneliness appears, you learn how to remain present with your own heart instead of immediately reaching outward to escape it. This is where real strength begins, not in avoiding pain, but in learning how to stay with yourself through it. Most people have never been taught this. The moment discomfort appears, they seek distraction. The moment uncertainty rises, they seek reassurance. The moment emptiness touches the heart, they reach for someone to fill it. And this is why the mind becomes dependent. It never learns that it can survive its own weather. But Buddhist practice returns again and again to stillness. Sit, breathe, observe, stay. Not because silence is easy, but because this is where inner strength is formed. The Buddha did not teach peace as something to be found in perfect conditions. He taught it as something to be cultivated in the middle of impermanence, slowly, quietly, from within. And this changes the way the mind begins to move through life. You stop panicking every time discomfort appears. You stop treating every difficult feeling as an emergency. You stop believing that loneliness means something is wrong, or that uncertainty means something is broken. Instead, you begin to understand that not every uncomfortable feeling needs to be escaped. Some feelings are not here to destroy you. They are here to teach you how to remain. And the more you remain, the stronger the mind becomes. You begin to trust yourself in a different way, not because life becomes easier, but because you no longer abandon yourself every time it becomes difficult. When someone withdraws, your worth does not collapse with their attention. When affection changes, your sense of self does not disappear with it. When life becomes unclear, the mind may still feel uncertainty, but it no longer drowns in it. There is sadness, yes. There is disappointment, yes. But there is also steadiness now, a quiet center that remains. This is what inner strength feels like. Not hardness, not emotional numbness, but stability. A mind that can feel deeply without falling apart. A heart that can love without losing itself. A person who can stand in uncertainty without begging life to become predictable before allowing themselves peace. This is the gift of self-reliance. It returns your power to where it always belonged. No longer scattered across other people's moods, no longer tied to their timing, their choices, their ability to understand what you feel. Your peace begins to rest in something deeper now. Your own awareness, your own steadiness, your own ability to return to yourself again and again, no matter what life is doing around you. And from that place, everything begins to soften. Relationships become lighter because they are no longer carrying the full weight of your emotional survival. Love becomes cleaner because it is no longer tangled in silent dependency. You can receive care without clinging to it. You can be disappointed without being destroyed. You can be alone without feeling abandoned. This is what makes self-reliance so freeing. It does not close the heart, it steadies it. And when the mind learns how to return to itself, even in discomfort, even in uncertainty, even in loneliness, it becomes strong in the quietest and most unshakable way. Not because life stopped changing, but because you no longer need it to stay still in order to remain at peace. 7. Ask for less, and peace begins to grow. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, and not because people suddenly become wiser, kinder, or more consistent. Peace begins to grow because the mind becomes less demanding. It stops pulling so hard on life. It stops asking every moment to carry more than it was ever meant to hold. This is where so much suffering quietly begins. Not always in what life denies you, but in what the mind keeps insisting life should provide. More understanding, more attention, more reassurance, more certainty, more love in the exact shape you imagined it should arrive. The mind is always reaching, always measuring, always asking. It asks people to be more available than they are. It asks moments to feel more complete than they can. It asks life to become softer, clearer, easier, more aligned with what it hoped. And slowly, without noticing, the heart becomes tired. At first, this constant asking feels natural. It feels like longing, like emotional need, like the simple desire to be seen and understood. And there is nothing wrong with wanting warmth. There is nothing wrong with wanting love, kindness, care, or connection. These are human desires. They are tender. They are real. The suffering begins when desire quietly becomes demand, when hope hardens into expectation, and the mind begins believing that peace can only exist if life gives more. This is what the Buddha warned so gently against. He taught that suffering grows where craving takes root, and craving is not always loud or obvious. It does not always look like greed. Sometimes it looks like emotional hunger. Sometimes it sounds like, they should understand me better, they should care more, they should give more. Life should be easier than this. People should know what I need without asking. Beneath these thoughts is the same restless movement of the mind, asking reality to become something other than what it is. And this is where peace begins to disappear. Because the more the mind asks from life, the less life begins to feel enough. Even when kindness is offered, it feels incomplete. Even when love is present, it feels insufficient. Even when someone tries, the mind notices what was missing before it notices what was given. This is how suffering becomes subtle. It does not always arrive as pain. Sometimes it arrives as constant dissatisfaction, a quiet feeling that nothing is quite enough, no gesture complete enough, no person attentive enough, no moment fulfilling enough to finally let the heart rest. And so the mind keeps reaching, it keeps asking, it keeps waiting for something more complete to arrive before allowing peace in. This is what exhausts the heart. Not always pain, but the endless hunger for life to give more than this moment can offer. But something begins to change when you ask for less. Not less love, not less meaning, but less demand, less insistence. Less pressure placed on life to become perfect before you allow yourself to be at peace. This is where the heart begins to soften. When you ask for less, you stop measuring every moment against what it failed to give. You stop turning every interaction into an emotional test. You stop asking people to meet needs they may not yet know how to hold. And because of that, the mind becomes quieter. A delayed message no longer feels like rejection. A small kindness no longer feels too small. A simple moment no longer needs to become extraordinary to be enough. And suddenly, life begins to feel lighter. Not because more has been added, but because less is being demanded. This is one of the quiet miracles of letting go. The less the mind insists, the more it begins to notice. Things that once felt ordinary begin to feel meaningful again. A thoughtful word, a brief moment of warmth, a soft morning, a little silence, a simple kindness. These things were always there, but the mind was too busy asking for more to receive them fully. This is why peace grows in simplicity. Not because simplicity gives you everything, but because it teaches the heart how to stop fighting what is here. The Buddha taught gratitude not as performance, but as perception, a way of seeing clearly, a way of noticing what is already present when craving is no longer crowding the mind. When the hunger softens, appreciation begins. And when appreciation begins, peace quietly follows. You begin to see that so much of what disturbed you was not always life itself, but the pressure you placed upon it. The need for more, the demand for better, the refusal to let this moment be enough. And when that pressure begins to dissolve, the nervous system softens with it. The heart unclenches, the mind becomes less sharp, less restless, less burdened by what is missing. This is where peace begins to grow. Not in abundance, not in perfect love, not in finally receiving everything the heart once asked for, but in the quiet moment the asking softens and the mind no longer needs more in order to feel whole. That is the peace most people overlook. Not the peace of having everything, but the peace of no longer demanding that life give more before allowing yourself to rest. 8. Peace enters when expectation leaves, though at first it does not arrive like something dramatic. It comes quietly, almost unnoticed, like a room becoming softer after a long noise has ended, like the body loosening after holding tension for so long it forgot what ease felt like. This is how peace returns. Not all at once, but gently, when the mind stops demanding that life unfold according to its private plans. Most people do not realize how much expectation shapes their emotional life. They think they are reacting to what is happening, but often they are reacting to what they believed should have happened instead. This is where so much inner tension begins, not in reality itself, but in the distance between reality and expectation. You expected more understanding, more effort, more care, more certainty. You expected people to notice what you never said. You expected them to carry what you were silently hoping they would hold. And when they did not, the mind tightened, not always with anger, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with disappointment, sometimes with that quiet heaviness that settles in the chest when life does not meet the shape you had imagined for it. This is how expectation disturbs peace. It teaches the mind to resist what is here by clinging to what should have been. The Buddha spoke often about this quiet resistance. He taught that suffering does not only come from pain, it comes from attachment, from the mind's refusal to let life be what it is. And expectation is one of the most common ways this attachment appears. It asks reality to be different before the heart agrees to soften. It says, "I will be at peace when this changes. I will relax when they understand. I will feel okay when life finally gives me what I hoped for." Until then, the mind waits. And in that waiting, peace is postponed. This is the deeper cost of expectation. It does not only create disappointment, it delays peace. It places your calm somewhere in the future, somewhere conditional, somewhere dependent on other people becoming more aware, more available, more emotionally capable than they may know how to be. And so the heart remains restless, not because peace is absent, but because expectation keeps standing in the doorway. Expectation always asks for something more before it allows rest, more certainty, more reassurance, more clarity, more proof that things are safe enough, stable enough, complete enough to finally let go. But life rarely offers that kind of certainty. People are imperfect, timing shifts, emotions change, understanding comes and goes, and if peace depends on all of this becoming predictable, peace will always feel distant. But the moment expectation begins to leave, even slightly, something inside begins to open. The mind stops gripping so tightly, it stops measuring every moment against what it failed to be. It stops turning ordinary human limitation into personal pain. A delayed reply becomes a delayed reply. A change in tone becomes a passing mood. A moment of distance becomes what it is, not a story the mind must suffer through. This is how peace begins to enter, not because life becomes easier, but because the mind becomes less resistant to life as it is. And in that softening, the nervous system begins to settle. The body holds less tension, the heart becomes less guarded. You no longer spend so much energy bracing against disappointment, trying to predict outcomes, preparing yourself for what might go wrong if life does not move the way you hoped. Something in you simply begins to rest, not because everything is resolved, but because the mind is no longer fighting what is unresolved. And this is where peace becomes more than an idea. It becomes a way of moving through life. You begin to notice how much suffering was never created by the moment itself, but by the argument the mind kept having with the moment. Life was not always hurting you in the ways you believed. Often, it was simply refusing to become what you had imagined. And the mind, unable to accept that, kept turning resistance into pain. But when expectation loosens, that argument begins to quiet. You stop asking every silence to mean something. You stop asking every shift in energy to become a threat. You stop reading absence as rejection, delay as neglect, or uncertainty as danger. The mind becomes less dramatic, less defensive, less eager to turn every small discomfort into emotional proof that something is wrong. And because of that, something gentle begins to return. Space. Space between what happens and what you feel about it. Space between someone's behavior and the meaning you attach to it. Space between discomfort and reaction. And in that space, peace has room to breathe. This is what expectation takes from the mind. It takes space. It fills the inner world with pressure, interpretation, and emotional noise. It keeps the heart leaning forward, always waiting for the next response, the next reassurance, the next sign that things are safe enough to relax. But peace does not enter a crowded mind easily. It enters when there is room. Room to observe without rushing to react. Room to feel without immediately turning feeling into suffering. Room to let life be unfinished, unclear, imperfect, and still not let that disturb the center of who you are. This is the quiet gift of releasing expectation. You stop needing every moment to confirm your worth. You stop needing every person to prove their care in the exact way you hoped. You stop demanding emotional certainty from a world that has never promised permanence. And because of that, life begins to feel less hostile. Not perfect, not always kind, but no longer constantly in conflict with what the mind needed it to be. There is more softness now, more breath in the body, more patience in the heart. You begin to meet life with less tension, less urgency, less fear of being disappointed by what it cannot give. And in that softer way of meeting life, peace no longer feels like something distant or rare. It begins to feel available, quietly, naturally, already here. Already here, waiting beneath the noise the mind once created, waiting beneath the pressure, beneath the grasping, beneath the constant habit of asking life to become different before allowing yourself to rest. This is what begins to reveal itself when expectation leaves. Peace was not missing, it was covered. Covered by the mind's constant negotiation with reality, covered by the silent belief that calm must be earned through perfect outcomes. Covered by the exhausting habit of tying your inner state to things that were never meant to control it. And once this becomes clear, life begins to feel different. Not because it has changed in some dramatic way, but because you have stopped meeting it with so much resistance. The same people may still be imperfect, the same uncertainties may still exist. Some things will still arrive late, some people will still misunderstand you, some moments will still fail to become what you hoped they would be. But now, these things no longer enter the heart with the same force. They touch you differently because the mind is no longer gripping them so tightly. This is what expectation was always doing. It was tightening the mind around every outcome. It was turning ordinary human imperfection into emotional suffering. It was making every delay feel heavier, every misunderstanding feel sharper, every unmet hope feel more personal than it needed to be. But now there is space where that tension used to live. And in that space, the heart begins to breathe differently. You stop needing immediate reassurance to feel steady. You stop asking every uncertain moment to explain itself before you can remain calm. You stop trying to control how others feel, how quickly they respond, how clearly they understand, how perfectly they love. You begin to let people be limited without turning their limitations into your wound. This is not detachment in the cold sense. This is emotional maturity. This is the quiet strength of no longer making your peace dependent on what other people have the capacity to give. The Buddha taught that wisdom is not found in controlling life, but in seeing it clearly. And to see clearly is to stop asking the world to be less human than it is. People forget. People fail. People become distracted. People love imperfectly. They carry wounds you cannot see and limits they may not yet understand. When expectation rules the mind, all of this becomes personal. But when expectation leaves, understanding enters. And with understanding comes softness. You begin to see people more honestly, not through the lens of what you hoped they would be, but through the reality of what they are able to offer. Some can meet you deeply, some cannot. Some can hold your heart gently. Some are still learning how to hold their own. And instead of suffering every time someone gives less than you hoped, you begin to accept what is true without making it heavier than it needs to be. This is where peace deepens. Not in finally receiving everything you once longed for, but in no longer needing life to constantly prove itself before you allow yourself to be okay. And this changes the way the heart moves through the world. You become less reactive, less easily disturbed, less emotionally thrown by what once unsettled you so quickly. The same silence that once created anxiety now passes without so much noise. The same uncertainty that once felt unbearable now feels temporary. The same absence that once triggered fear now feels like information, not rejection. You begin to trust stillness more than interpretation. You begin to trust presence more than prediction. You begin to trust your own ability to remain steady in moments that once would have disturbed your peace. And this is where something beautiful happens. The energy once spent managing disappointment becomes available for something gentler: presence, gratitude, clarity. You begin to notice what expectation once kept hidden: a quiet kindness, a simple moment, a little peace in an ordinary day, a softness in yourself that could not be felt while the mind was still gripping so tightly. This is why peace feels so natural when it finally returns, because it was never something foreign. It was what remained when the struggle softened. Peace enters when expectation leaves, because expectation was never protection. It was pressure. It was resistance. It was the mind trying to secure itself through control. And when that control loosens, the heart remembers something deeper. That peace does not come from getting everything you hoped for. It comes from no longer needing life to be different before you allow yourself to rest. This is the quiet freedom of letting expectation leave. Nothing dramatic changes on the outside, but within you, everything becomes lighter. And at last, the peace you kept waiting for no longer feels far away. It feels like home. 9. When expectation ends, people become easier to understand. Not because they suddenly change, and not because they become easier to deal with, but because the mind finally stops looking at them through the lens of what it wanted them to be. And that changes everything. So much of human disappointment is not created by who people are. It is created by the distance between who they are and who we expected them to be. We suffer not only because someone failed us, but because we had already imagined them differently. Kinder, deeper, more aware, more emotionally available, more capable of giving what we needed in the way we hoped to receive it. And when they do not meet that image, pain begins. This is why expectation distorts understanding. It places a filter over reality. You no longer see people clearly. You see them through desire, through hope, through projection. You do not see what they are showing you. You see what you wanted their actions to mean. And this is where confusion begins. The Buddha taught that suffering often comes not from reality itself, but from illusion, from the mind's habit of creating stories and mistaking them for truth. This is what expectation does. It creates an imagined version of a person, then suffers when reality does not match it. You expect consistency from someone who has never been steady. You expect emotional depth from someone who avoids their own feelings. You expect clarity from someone still living in confusion. And when they fail to give what they were never truly capable of giving, the mind experiences it as betrayal. But often, it was not betrayal, it was misperception. This is what begins to soften when expectation ends. You stop asking people to become who you hoped they were, and begin seeing who they have been all along. You begin noticing patterns without trying to excuse them. You begin hearing what people reveal through their actions, not just through the words you wanted to believe. You stop confusing potential with presence. You stop confusing longing with truth. And slowly, people become easier to understand, not because they become simpler, but because you stop making them more complicated with projection. A distant person becomes simply distant. An inconsistent person becomes simply inconsistent. A kind person becomes kind. A wounded person becomes wounded. You stop forcing meaning where there is only pattern. You stop inventing depth where there is only avoidance. You stop turning someone's limitation into a mystery you need to solve. And in that clarity, the heart becomes calmer, because understanding becomes simpler when expectation is no longer distorting what is plainly there. You begin to realize how much suffering came from trying to interpret people through hope instead of truth. Hope made you explain away what was clear. It made you call inconsistency confusion. It made you call avoidance complexity. It made you call emotional unavailability bad timing. The mind, wanting connection, often softens what it sees, so it does not have to face what is there. This is one of the quiet ways expectation protects illusion. It does not always distort people by making them seem worse than they are. Sometimes it distorts them by making them seem more capable, more aware, more emotionally available than they have ever truly shown themselves to be. And this is where so much emotional confusion begins. Not in what people hide, but in what we keep trying not to see. When expectation is strong, the mind does not relate to who someone is. It relates to who they might become. It clings to potential. It attaches to glimpses. A kind moment becomes evidence of deep care. A brief softness becomes proof of emotional depth. A few beautiful words become enough to ignore many repeated actions. This is how expectation keeps the heart attached to possibility, while reality quietly keeps showing you pattern. And pattern is often the truth expectation tries hardest to avoid. The Buddha taught that wisdom begins with seeing clearly, not harshly, not bitterly, clearly. To see clearly is not to judge people for their limits. It is simply to stop suffering because you keep asking those limits to become something else. This changes the way you understand people. You stop personalizing what is simply their level of awareness. You stop taking their emotional limits as proof of your unworthiness. You stop turning their inability to love well into a question about whether you were worthy of being loved well. And this is where the heart becomes lighter, because people become easier to understand when you stop making their behavior about your value. Some people are kind but inconsistent. Some are warm but emotionally unavailable. Some are sincere but unhealed. Some care, but only in the limited way their own inner world allows. This does not always make them bad, but it does make them clear, and clarity is kinder than confusion. Confusion keeps the heart trapped in interpretation. Clarity lets it rest. You no longer spend your energy decoding mixed signals, over-explaining poor behavior, or trying to extract deeper meaning from repeated patterns that have already revealed enough. You stop asking what they meant and begin seeing what they do. You stop chasing hidden answers inside obvious behavior. And with that, people become less emotionally exhausting. Not because they stop being imperfect, but because you stop resisting what their imperfection has already shown you. This is where understanding becomes peaceful. You begin to meet people where they truly are, not where your hope kept placing them. And this changes everything. Expectations fall, projection softens, the need to force meaning begins to fade. In its place comes something quieter, something steadier. Discernment. You begin to understand that not everyone is meant to meet you deeply. Not everyone knows how to hold tenderness. Not everyone has done the inner work required to love with clarity. Some people can only meet you from their wounds, some only from their habits, some only from their fear. And when you stop asking them to meet you from a place they have not yet reached within themselves, suffering begins to loosen. Because now, instead of trying to make sense of every contradiction, you simply see what is. And what is becomes much easier to understand. And once you begin to see people clearly, something inside you grows quieter. You stop chasing explanations that do not change the truth. You stop needing every confusing behavior to make emotional sense before you allow yourself to move on. You stop waiting for perfect closure from people who may never be clear enough to give it. And this is where peace begins to return. Because understanding was never about decoding every person completely. It was about seeing enough to stop suffering through confusion. The Buddha taught that clarity is a form of compassion, not only for others, but for yourself. To see clearly is to stop forcing the heart to remain in places where reality has already spoken. It is to stop calling repeated pain a mystery. It is to stop asking uncertainty to become certainty before you trust what it has already shown you. This is where emotional freedom deepens. You no longer need people to become clearer than their actions. You no longer need more proof than the pattern already gave. You no longer need to keep hoping someone will become who they have not yet learned to be. And because of that, people become easier to understand, not because they reveal everything, but because you stop resisting what they already revealed. And in that acceptance, there is less confusion, less projection, less pain. You begin to meet people with clearer eyes, steadier expectations, and a quieter heart. This is how peace protects itself, not by asking people to become easier, but by seeing them clearly enough that they no longer have the power to confuse your peace. 10. There is quiet power in expecting nothing. There is a quiet kind of freedom that begins to take shape within a person the moment they stop expecting the world to behave according to their emotional needs. It does not happen all at once. It begins slowly, almost invisibly, like a subtle shift in the way the mind relates to people. But once that shift begins, something inside becomes lighter, calmer, and far less fragile. What starts to grow is not distance from others, but strength within yourself. Most people are raised to believe that closeness is built on expectation. From an early age, we learn to assume that love should look a certain way, friendship should feel a certain way, and loyalty should be returned in the same form we offer it. We expect understanding from those we care about. We expect support when we are struggling. We expect people to show up in ways that make us feel seen, valued, and important. Over time, these expectations become so normal that we stop noticing how much of our emotional life depends on them. But this is where much of human disappointment begins. Expectations often live silently in the mind, unspoken yet powerful. They form invisible rules for how others should behave, how they should respond, how they should care. And when people fail to meet those inner conditions, the mind turns that difference into pain. Disappointment appears. Resentment follows. We begin questioning their intentions, their loyalty, their love. Yet what hurts us most is often not what they did, but the quiet story we created about what they were supposed to do. This is why so much emotional suffering has less to do with reality and more to do with attachment. We become attached not only to people, but to the version of them we created in our minds. We become attached to outcomes, to imagined responses, to the comfort of things unfolding the way we hoped. And when life moves differently, the mind resists. That resistance becomes frustration. That frustration becomes suffering. The more expectations we carry, the more ways we give ourselves to be disturbed. Every unmet hope becomes another reason to feel hurt. Every small deviation becomes another emotional reaction. But when expectations begin to loosen, the mind also begins to soften. Life becomes less exhausting because you are no longer trying to force people into roles they were never meant to perform. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to reaching outward for reassurance. It has spent years depending on attention to feel important, on praise to feel worthy, on consistency from others to feel secure. So when those expectations begin to fade, it may feel like something is missing. But what is actually disappearing is not love, it is dependency. And what begins to replace it is something far more stable. You begin to find steadiness in your own presence. Instead of needing others to constantly confirm your value, you start becoming less dependent on external validation. Your peace no longer rises and falls based on how quickly someone replies, how warmly they respond, or how closely they mirror your effort. Their behavior may still affect your experience, but it no longer controls your inner state. This is where real emotional independence begins. Your attention returns to the one place it was always meant to rest your own mind. You begin noticing your reactions more clearly. You become aware of how often your suffering was never caused by the moment itself, but by the expectation you placed upon it. What once felt personal begins to feel neutral. What once felt like rejection begins to look like ordinary human limitation. A delayed message no longer feels like neglect. It feels like life happening. A misunderstanding no longer feels like betrayal. It feels like two minds seeing differently. This shift may seem small, but it changes everything. When you stop personalizing every disappointment, you stop multiplying unnecessary pain. Relationships also begin to change in a healthier way. Without expectation weighing on every interaction, connection becomes lighter. You stop measuring every gesture. You stop silently testing who cares enough. You stop turning every moment into evidence of who loves you and who does not. Instead, you allow people to be who they are. And from that space, relationships become less performative and more honest. When someone is kind, you appreciate it. When someone shows up with sincerity, you receive it with gratitude. But when they fall short, your peace does not collapse around their absence. You no longer need others to behave perfectly in order to remain grounded. That is where freedom begins, not in controlling people, but in no longer needing them to complete your emotional stability. And perhaps the most beautiful change of all is this: when expectation fades, gratitude becomes easier. The smallest kindness begins to feel meaningful again. A thoughtful word, a quiet gesture, a moment of genuine presence. These things feel deeper because they are no longer demanded by the mind. They are received as gifts, not obligations. This is the quiet strength of expecting less, not indifference, not detachment from love, but freedom from the belief that your peace must be managed by someone else. And in that freedom, the heart becomes calmer, the mind becomes clearer, and life begins to feel far less heavy. Peace begins to return when the mind stops constantly comparing reality to the version of life it had imagined. Much of human suffering comes not from what happens, but from the silent conflict between what is and what we believed should be. The mind becomes exhausted trying to force life into its preferred shape. But when that inner resistance begins to fade, something softer takes its place. The mind becomes calmer because it is no longer fighting reality at every turn. This is where a deeper kind of freedom begins. Real freedom does not come from controlling people, circumstances, or outcomes. It comes from learning how not to be controlled by them. Life will remain uncertain. People will still be unpredictable. Situations will not always unfold in ways that feel fair or comfortable. But when the mind no longer insists that everything must happen according to its desires, life becomes much easier to carry. This does not mean becoming cold or detached from others. It does not mean withdrawing from love, friendship, or human connection. It means learning how to care without making your peace dependent on how others behave. You can still love people deeply, support them sincerely, and show kindness freely. The difference is that your emotional stability no longer rises and falls with their actions. You begin to give without secretly expecting the same in return. You can offer patience without demanding understanding. You can support someone without needing constant appreciation. Your care becomes cleaner because it is no longer weighed down by silent expectations. You stop giving as a way to secure emotional comfort and begin giving from a place of genuine presence. This creates a powerful kind of balance. Happiness begins to feel less fragile because it is no longer built entirely on what others do or fail to do. People may still disappoint you. They may misunderstand your intentions, ignore your efforts, or fail to meet the standard of care you once expected from them. But those moments no longer have the same power to disturb your inner world. This does not mean you lower your standards or accept poor treatment. You still recognize disrespect. You still notice when someone behaves carelessly. But the difference is that your emotional center no longer collapses every time someone fails to meet your expectations. You respond with clarity instead of emotional chaos. That is where true inner strength begins to form. A person who no longer depends on praise, attention, or approval becomes much harder to manipulate. They are not easily controlled by flattery, nor deeply shaken by criticism. Their sense of worth no longer comes from outside validation, so the opinions of others begin to lose their power. This is the quiet freedom that wisdom points toward. Not the freedom of escaping life, but the freedom of living within it without being emotionally ruled by every disappointment, reaction, or change. You still feel, you still care, but you are no longer constantly disturbed by what you cannot control. And in that steadiness, something important becomes clear. Peace does not come from forcing life to match your expectations. It comes from loosening your grip on how life should unfold. The less tightly the mind clings, the lighter it becomes. And the lighter it becomes, the easier it is to live, to love, and to remain at peace. 11. When you stop expecting, your mind finally finds peace. There is a quiet peace that begins to enter your life the moment you stop expecting the world to behave according to your personal desires. Most people spend years exhausting themselves, not because life is always difficult, but because the mind is constantly arguing with what is happening. It holds on to an image of how people should act, how situations should unfold, and how life should respond to its efforts. When reality moves differently, frustration begins, disappointment appears, inner conflict follows. What disturbs most people is not life itself, but the constant resistance to the way life truly is. The mind creates suffering when it becomes attached to imagined outcomes. It quietly decides how others should treat you, how much they should care, how quickly they should respond, and how often they should understand you without explanation. These expectations often remain unspoken, yet they carry enormous emotional weight. The moment people fail to meet them, the mind reacts. It feels hurt, overlooked, or betrayed. But much of that pain is not created by what happened. It is created by the gap between what happened and what the mind expected to happen. This is why expectation is one of the most exhausting habits the mind can carry. It keeps your peace tied to things you cannot control. It places your emotional stability in the hands of people, circumstances, and outcomes that were never fully yours to manage. As long as your peace depends on others behaving the way you prefer, your inner world remains fragile. Every delayed reply becomes a problem. Every misunderstanding feels personal. Every unmet hope becomes another reason to suffer. But something begins to change the moment you loosen that grip. When you stop expecting people to behave according to your inner script, the mind begins to relax. It no longer wastes energy measuring every action against an imagined standard. It no longer turns every disappointment into emotional turmoil. Instead, it begins to see things more clearly. People act according to their nature, their awareness, their wounds, and their limitations. Life unfolds according to countless conditions beyond your control. The more deeply this is understood, the less personally everything feels. This is where peace begins, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because the mind stops making everything heavier than it needs to be. You stop demanding that people always understand you. You stop expecting constant validation in order to feel worthy. You stop needing others to prove your value through attention, praise, or perfect behavior. And as those expectations begin to fade, the mind becomes less reactive, less dependent, and far more stable. This does not mean becoming indifferent. It does not mean you stop caring about people or withdraw from relationships. It means you begin to care in a healthier way. You can still love, still give, still support, but without making your peace dependent on what comes back. You can be kind without needing equal kindness in return. You can show up sincerely without demanding recognition. That is where emotional freedom begins to take root. When you stop expecting, your mind becomes quieter. It no longer lives in constant tension with reality. It stops trying to control what was never fully in its hands. And in that release, something gentle begins to grow. A steadier heart, a calmer mind, a peace that no longer disappears every time life refuses to behave the way you hoped it would. From that point, a different kind of strength begins to form within you. It is quieter than pride, softer than control, and far more stable than approval. It is the strength that comes from no longer needing life to constantly reassure you. When expectation fades, the mind is no longer pulled in every direction by what others say, what they fail to do, or how closely reality matches your preferences. It begins to settle into something far more reliable than circumstance. It begins to settle into itself. This is why peace becomes possible. Not because the world suddenly becomes kinder, more predictable, or easier to manage, but because your inner state is no longer chained to every movement around you. People may still misunderstand you. They may fail to show up the way you hoped. They may offer less than what you once believed you deserved. But these things no longer carry the same power to shake your foundation. You begin to see clearly that other people can affect your experience, but they do not have to control your peace. That understanding changes the way you move through life. You stop taking everything personally. You stop interpreting every delay as rejection, every silence as disrespect, and every difference as betrayal. What once felt deeply personal begins to feel far more neutral. You start to realize that many things were never about you to begin with. People respond from their own confusion, their own fears, their own limitations, and their own inner unrest. Once this becomes clear, your mind stops creating unnecessary suffering around what was never yours to carry. This shift also changes the way you relate to others. You become less controlling, less reactive, and less emotionally demanding. You stop trying to force people into roles they cannot fulfill. You stop asking others to become the source of your emotional security. Instead, you begin meeting people as they are, not as your expectations wanted them to be. And in doing so, relationships begin to feel lighter, more honest, and far less exhausting. You learn to appreciate what is given without becoming disturbed by what is not. When someone offers kindness, you receive it with gratitude. When someone brings sincerity, you value it. But when they fall short, your peace remains steady because it was never built entirely on their behavior. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is emotional maturity. It is the ability to remain open without becoming dependent. As this way of living deepens, even disappointment begins to change its shape. It may still visit, but it no longer stays as long. It no longer turns into resentment so easily. The mind recovers faster because it is no longer clinging to the belief that life owed it something different. You begin to understand that peace is not the result of getting what you want. It is the result of no longer needing everything to go your way in order to remain inwardly stable. That is when the heart becomes lighter. Not because life gives you perfect people or perfect outcomes, but because the mind stops demanding perfection in order to feel safe. And in that release, a quiet resilience begins to grow. You become less fragile, less easily disturbed, and less dependent on external conditions for inner calm. This is the beginning of real peace. Not the peace that comes from control, but the peace that comes from no longer needing control at all. And as that peace begins to deepen, life starts to feel different in ways that are difficult to explain until they are experienced. The same world is still around you. People are still imperfect. Circumstances are still uncertain. Delays still happen. Misunderstandings still arise. Not everything becomes easier, but something within you is no longer so easily disturbed by it all. What changes is not the world. What changes is the way your mind meets it. You begin to notice how much suffering once came from the simple habit of mental resistance. The mind was always trying to correct, control, predict, or secure what could never be fully controlled. It wanted reassurance from uncertain people. It wanted permanence from temporary things. It wanted clarity from minds that were often confused themselves. And, because of that, it lived in constant tension. It kept reaching outward, asking the world to provide what only inner steadiness could truly offer. When that habit begins to dissolve, the nervous system softens with it. There is less urgency in your reactions, less emotional noise in your thoughts, less tension in the way you move through the day. The mind no longer treats every inconvenience as a threat, or every disappointment as proof of something personal. It becomes slower to react, calmer in uncertainty, and less eager to turn every moment into a problem that must be solved immediately. This is where emotional freedom becomes real. You no longer need every conversation to go perfectly in order to feel secure. You no longer need constant reassurance in order to feel valued. You no longer need others to behave consistently just to maintain your sense of peace. That dependence begins to fall away, and with it falls a great deal of unnecessary suffering. What replaces it is not indifference, but stability. You still care, you still love, you still notice when something feels right or wrong, but your emotional state is no longer held hostage by every shift in mood, every change in tone, or every unmet expectation. You begin to respond with more clarity because your reactions are no longer clouded by the pressure of emotional dependency. This is when discernment becomes stronger. You begin to see people more clearly, not through the lens of what you hoped they would be, but through the truth of how they consistently show up. Without expectation distorting your perception, there is less confusion. You no longer confuse potential with character. You no longer confuse attention with care. You no longer mistake temporary warmth for genuine depth. You begin seeing what is actually there, not what your desire wanted to believe. And that clarity changes everything. It helps you stop chasing what cannot nourish you. It helps you stop pleading for what must be given freely. It helps you stop investing yourself in places where peace is constantly disturbed. Instead of trying to force connection, force understanding, or force reciprocity, you begin to step back and let people reveal themselves through their patterns. This saves enormous emotional energy. As a result, your relationships become more peaceful, not because everyone suddenly becomes easier to love, but because you are no longer carrying the burden of trying to make everyone meet your internal demands. You begin allowing people to be who they are, and from that place, your decisions become wiser. You know what to welcome, what to appreciate, what to distance yourself from, and what no longer deserves your emotional investment. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is emotional intelligence. It is the ability to remain open without becoming naive. It is the ability to care without surrendering your inner balance. It is the ability to love without losing yourself in the process. And this is where the deepest peace begins to reveal itself. Not in getting everything you hoped for, but in no longer needing life to constantly confirm your desires in order to feel whole. There is a profound relief in no longer asking the world to complete you. There is a quiet power in no longer needing every outcome to go your way. The heart becomes steadier because it is no longer built on fragile conditions. In the end, this is what peace truly asks of you. Not that you control life, but that you stop demanding it obey your expectations. The moment that demand begins to loosen, suffering begins to loosen with it. And in that space, the mind finds what it had been searching for all along. Not perfect outcomes, not perfect people, but the deep and lasting peace of no longer needing either. Peace begins the moment you stop asking life to unfold exactly as you imagined. When you release the need for perfect responses, perfect outcomes, and constant reassurance, the mind finally learns how to rest. You still care, still love, and still move through life with an open heart, but no longer with a restless one. That is the quiet power of expecting less. You suffer less, react less, and fear less because your peace is no longer tied to what others do. And in that freedom, you discover something deeper than control, deeper than approval, and far more lasting than expectation: a calm mind, an open heart, and real peace.